Hello guys, welcome to episode 4 of the Pathway to Podium podcast. I am your host Vanessa English, and we are lucky to be joined by not one but 2 guests today, Dr. Rob Miller and Dr. Michael Johnston. What are we going to be talking about today, guys?
Today we're just going to be talking through some of our thoughts and experiences around considerations for an S&C program for a Jiu Jitsu athlete.
Great, ready to roll?
Let's roll.
Let's roll, guys.
We're off, we're recording.
Okay. Look at us. Okay, so do you guys want to fight it out over who's going to introduce themselves first?
Age before beauty.
The fighting hasn't worked out well for Rob yet. So, I am Michael Johnston. I am the head of sports science for the British track and field team. I've been working in elite sport now, coming up to 20 years, primarily in strength and conditioning, but then moving across now more into management of different sports scientists, and worked across a lot of sports, and then privately have been working with jiu-jitsu athletes for the last probably 4 years now.
Yeah, very similar. So I am currently working with UK Athletics as the Olympic Pathway strength and conditioning coach. Sat next to me here is my boss in that role. I've kind of come from a multi-sport background initially, where I did my internship in Northern Ireland, did my university degree there, and I've been across the UK 8 years working with athletics, and done my PhD alongside that. And then obviously we've started off a startup in Informed Performance. I've been working privately with multi-sport and quite a lot of jiu-jitsu athletes in the last kind of 3-4 years.
That's awesome. Did you want to talk a little bit about your PhD?
I'll give a brief overview, but essentially the whole idea was to undertake some research that can help win medals. What that ended up looking like was looking at the importance of various or basically a specific muscle size and its relevance back to sprinting, and we found a couple of interesting things, but it looks like the glute max is pretty important. A bigger bum in essence essentially makes you run fast, or has the potential to. So it was a long time coming. It took 8 years to finish. Oh, wow. So it was a long piece of research.
Not to fill his head with anything, but his PhD was very good. I think his first study's probably already more referenced than my entire PhD.
Wow. That's excellent. Congratulations.
That was, you can just thank the Daily Mail for that one. They took it and ran with it. So
they like the big butt thing.
Exactly, right. It's way more clickbaity than yours was. Yeah, easy.
As usual, guys, we are in very good hands today, and we're going to be talking about some conditioning strength stuff surrounding BJJ. Yep. So I don't know if you guys want a little story about my journey in strength and conditioning in jiu-jitsu.
I think that'd be very interesting.
13 years back. Yeah. Okay. So, when I first started competing, training was a bit crazy. My conditioning kind of involved carrying big medicine balls and running for about 10k, and it was awful. You know, my other team members would have punch bags on their backs and stuff, and we would just have to run. Our coach would drive beside us, shout at us for not getting back quick enough. He'd have an ice cream in his hand, and then he would drive off, and we would continue lugging these random objects back to the gym, and then from there this has taken a long time for us to run 10k. We'd get back to the gym and we'd just basically train despite our bodies being completely wrecked.
Like train jiu-jitsu or train?
Oh, yeah.
So this was your warm-up?
That was my warm-up. Yeah. That was my warm-up. That's how it began. I mean, it toughened me up, definitely. It made me tough.
Okay.
But yeah, it was generally kind of things like that, and it was just going to the max as hard as you possibly could, and out train everybody else. So I don't know if you guys have anything to say about that.
Rob, yeah.
Probably best if we leave that one. Just sounds like David Goggins was your S&C coach.
Oh god. Yeah, but I mean, from there, I started. I did start kind of lifting. I started with CrossFit, which that's probably overtraining quite a lot. Then, pretty much going to exhaustion still, frequently, but just kind of grinding through it for the most part. Big injury. And then started seeking more kind of evidence-based stuff, and then it's as if the gods listened and they brought you guys.
Good, yeah. No, I think the CrossFit one's really interesting because I think there is still a lot of people who will use CrossFit for their conditioning, and what I always think about it is CrossFit's a sport in its own right. And you're trying to then combine two sports, and if you're going to go hard on both sports, then something's got to give. And what we certainly think about when it comes to conditioning and a sort of a strength and conditioning plan is the strength and conditioning plan is there to support your sport rather than to compete with your sport. So that's kind of the first thing when it comes to a plan, that you shouldn't be so messed up from your conditioning that it impacts on your ability to do your sport. Because that's ultimately where you're going to make your money. That's where you're going to have the most important aspect of your training is the sport specific training. And that's certainly something coming from like Olympic sport and professional sport that we would really emphasize, that the athlete can't leave the gym or can't leave any sort of conditioning they do with us so tired and so ruined that the next session is impacted from it. So that's probably an interesting starting point from it, because I think there's a lot of merit in a lot of things actually people do in CrossFit, but I'm not convinced that you can combine those two things together without certainly, as you said, overtraining and feeling that you hit that sort of hole that you don't come out of. And it sounds easy to say that don't go as hard in your other training as you do in jiu-jitsu, but like a lot of people, especially as they move up through sport, they have that sort of attitude where they want to train really hard. They sort of, as you said, it's sort of like that idea of I'm going to outwork everybody, and they take that into every aspect of their training. So it's when they go in the gym, they're going, I'm going to outwork people here. I'm going to work super hard here. When they do any sort of conditioning off the mats as well, it's I'm going to outwork people here. When they do their conditioning on the mats, it's I'm going to outwork people here as well. And while that, I'm trying to think how to put it politely, while I think there's a lot of merit in that in terms of that concept of David Goggins and, as you said, like working hard. Working hard is important. In elite athletes, I don't think I've ever met an elite athlete that they haven't been willing to work hard. It's more the other way, that you're actually trying to almost pull them back a bit and make things fit together. I don't know if that's been your experience as well, Rob.
Absolutely. I think it's the most interesting as well whenever so some of the experience in track and field is with multi-eventers, when they've got so much stuff to do, and they're the ones that you kind of see that become really, really obvious, and where actually a lot of it is trying to manage that load as opposed to just fire more and more and more and more.
Do you find in other sports that's less that kind the thing where people are sort of overworking, or?
I think the difference is that if you think about the evolution of those sports and Olympic sports, they're further along their path than jiu-jitsu is. There has been, like I say, I've been doing this for 20 years. There's been professionals around Olympic sports for longer than that. So there is a better knowledge base in the sports evolved from that point. Whereas I do feel like jiu-jitsu is definitely evolving. You can see there's a lot of nice research starting to come up around jiu-jitsu. There's a lot of good conditioning coaches working with jiu-jitsu athletes now, so it is progressing on. But it's just earlier in its evolution to that point. So I do still think that you've got that mentality, and it's not a bad mentality to have of I'm going to outwork everybody. Whereas in those other sports, they are a little bit more shrewd, I guess, in terms of how they utilize their energy. Because you can't put I've always used this analogy. You've got it's almost like a pie. You've got a pie of how much many slices you can spend in different areas of training a week, right? And you want to spend that training time in the areas that are most important. And that's going to differ by person. For one person, it might be actually they're naturally really aerobically fit, and spending more time just rolling or just doing some technical training is going to have more impact. Whereas someone else, their limitation might be their aerobic capacity, that they get into a competition, they get deep into a competition, and they fatigue and they can't maintain their performance level all the way through. And there may be someone who needs to spend more of their training units in a different part of their week. So I don't know if there's a right or wrong with it. I'm certainly not saying that people training hard is a bad thing. But it's just it's picking your battles and making sure that you actually put that training where it really needs to be. And there will be times, and we talk about like periodization and everything with training, and all that is where do you, very simple terms, where do you spend your time? And you're going to, like, at certain periods you're going to spend more time doing different types of training. Like we were talking about it earlier, that actually the last few months you've been lifting 3 times a week. So you think about that in terms of periodization. You've had a block where you've put more emphasis on strength training, but now you're ramping up the amount of time you're spending on the mat. So as you do that there, then we've got to pull back what we do in the gym and take it maybe to twice a week to account for you upping it elsewhere. And that's all. When we talk about periodization, that's all it is. It's just changing the training in your week to allow you to achieve your goals.
It'd be interesting as well to hear like kind of what you've done in the past with it, but like there's periodization within maybe a year or a training cycle, but then there's also the periodization as you move through your career. That'll also change in terms of the emphasis that you want to put on certain stuff. And like, is that something you've consciously or unconsciously done in hindsight?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, what MJ's referring to, so I've I have been quite focused on trying to build muscle, trying to get stronger and stuff, but now I'm sort of coming back into competition, right? And I have been training a little bit more, but also I feel like I need a bit more technical stuff with the no-gi stuff, because I've been focusing a little bit more on no-gi. I'm very aware that the sport has evolved with the no-gi stuff, and I feel like I need to focus a little bit more on technique as well. So pulling back that gym work, I think, is quite important to me at the moment.
And I think that's where we're seeing that sort of evolution in terms of jiu-jitsu training. It's as simple as that, because it would have been very easy for you just to go, no, I'm going to keep doing the 3 sessions and I'm going to add more into my week. And then by adding more into your week, then you maybe can sustain it for a time. And then you crash.
There is that feeling that it's like a little voice that you have inside your head. It's
don't
like,
quit,
yeah,
don't
but
quit.
It's like, no, shush. So how what would you guys look at when building a program? Like what are the things that are really important when you go to programs?
Again, like jump in with this, Rob, as well, but like for me, I kind of think what you want to do is cause changes that are going to support jiu-jitsu. And what I mean by that, you've got I like this idea of like underpinning qualities. So as Rob sort of mentioned with his PhD, there's certain things that underpinning run fast, and one of the things he found was actually having big glutes, big ass, run fast, and but that's an underpinning quality. Like having muscle mass in that area is something that underpins sprint performance, and it's taking that concept and applying it to jiu-jitsu as well. So there's certain strength qualities that are going to underpin your ability. Say strength qualities, they're probably strength and movement qualities that are going to underpin your ability to do jiu-jitsu and play different types of games, especially in jiu-jitsu as well. So you're very flexible, you've got good mobility. If you didn't have that strength quality or that quality, then there's a certain type of game you wouldn't be able to play, right?
Absolutely.
But because you've got that there, then that allows you to access that game. And it's the same principle of other things, like having good upper body strength, having good grip strength, having good explosion in the lower body allows you to access a different type of game, and then it's up to you as the athlete to be able to actually, as you said, develop that tactical ability to utilize those qualities. But the job of the strength and conditioning in your program is to help you facilitate that, so as the limitation isn't physical. So the reason that you don't invert isn't a physical limitation. It's not a limitation either, be it around soreness or mobility. It's all those things are in place, and then it's about you developing the skill and utilizing the skill. It's kind of how I see it in terms of what we should be doing with a strength and conditioning program, making sure all the underpinning characteristics are being developed up.
So would you guys ever like prescribe mobility work for jiu-jitsu people?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's a huge thing, and I think really honest, there's probably like most people out there, it's probably the most neglected part of the training. We're talking about, again, we've talked about this previously, I think, but like what, I don't want to get caught up too much in research, but what research shows you when it comes to jiu-jitsu is that there's one nice study, and there's this thing called a functional movement screen, and it's got beaten up in the research a fair bit, but essentially what it's doing, it's looking at the symmetry between your body and left and right, and it's looking at symmetry in terms of how your body moves in different planes, by able to rotate, extend, and so on. And what they looked at that across different belt levels and different experience levels of jiu-jitsu athletes, and what they found was that as someone would keep being more experienced or was a higher belt level in jiu-jitsu, they scored worse on this test. So they
feels not surprising.
Yeah, and it isn't. And if you think about it, think what you're doing. You're playing guard on one side. Certainly, I am. You're passing to one side. You've got one side that you prefer.
We're broken.
So, you become broken. Yeah, you're sitting like I am now. Yeah, all the time. You're closed off. You're not opening your chest up.
Oh my God, I'm literally sat like this.
Yeah, he's not. He's actually got the best posture. But you're sitting in that position. You're like in this position, so your body adapts to that, because that's an adaptation that's probably in one way beneficial to jiu-jitsu, right? But then you become really asymmetrical, and you become probably more prone to injury. Because you lose extension in your hips, you lose external rotation in your shoulders, you start getting issues with your neck because you're rotated probably one side more than the other. You struggle to turn your chest one way versus the other because you've done something you really enjoy, but you've done it probably, most people, 6-8 hours a week, and that has a consequence. And actually having something that almost, is trying to, like, that pendulum swung all the way there, it's got having something that pulls that pendulum back in your week is a good way to think about that. There's your brain balance, and a lot of that's going to be mobility. So actually doing mobility, working on your neck mobility, and that can be just as simple as being able to look over your left shoulder and your right shoulder. Because like I know, trying to look over my right shoulder, like, I'm having to use my eyes, I can't actually get my neck around. And the same with your trunk. And then the same with your hips, just doing lots of stretches that are almost opening up from your shoulder to your hip to make sure that you've got that range through is a key thing. Yeah, absolutely. I think as well, one of the other things, like I think it'd be important just to highlight as well, is that mobility work doesn't necessarily just have to be stretching on the floor. Actually strength training for range and putting the joints for range and under load actually is another really good way to do it. And it's not necessarily like immobile in this area, I just have to do 4 hours of yoga a week. It's like strength training can be a really good kind of avenue for that as well. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great thing, yoga, working through range, and I think that's where good technique in the gym is super important, that you're actually working through range, and you've also got awareness of what your body's doing, that you're aware of whenever you aren't moving properly, or you've got someone who can help you with that, and you can actually have a look at you. And because it's, I think I've always said this here, like good athletes find a way of doing a movement, and they can almost like they find a way of almost cheating the movement to get into positions, and it's only whenever you've got someone there who's watching and forces you into feet position, making sure that you are symmetrical so you can see the difference, and actually that's when you can really notice what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So like in mobility and stuff. I think it is interesting because I think when you think of mobility work, you do immediately think like, you know, your sort of static stretches or yoga or something like that. And it is it's interesting because it you know, I think people forget that actually lifting can help, and quite often I've found people restrict their lifting because they think that they're not flexible enough for it. And that's something that I've come across quite frequently. I don't know if you guys have, but
I mean, there's a fine balance with that as well. You know, if it's like if there's a joint range of motion that you definitely don't have access to, it's probably not a good idea to put heaps of weight on the bar and fire yourself through it. But also it's like it's you know, with exercise variations or regressions or whatever, and a fairly sensible approach to building that up, there's a really nice way to actually make that range become more available to you, or whatever that is. So there's a fine line, but you've got to kind of teeter on the edge of that and see it improve over time. Right?
So I mean, this is what you guys would probably do as well, like you said about the regression and manipulating load and stuff in order to make improvements.
For sure. I think like one of the other things, you know, just going back to kind of like linking that almost back to your first question around building a program, it's one of the other things that we see a lot is individuals with big variations in body shape and anatomy. And with that, then you've got to look at what exercise variations may or may not suit that individual better. So like squatting is a really good example of someone with long femurs relative to their torso and vice versa. There's things that you'll change in terms of where the bar is positioned front to back on them, or how wide their feet are. And it's those sort of things that you'll start to look at even within one specific exercise. Is like what are the variables you're going to change for that individual to help make that better for them.
And I do also see, I'll just mention or hear people saying about height, and that it's very difficult to squat if you're tall.
Very debatable.
Yeah, I mean, Rob's pretty tall and he's got a good squat. It's not something I would agree with. I think what you more see is that, as Rob mentioned, their body proportions are slightly out, but like it's like anything, it's finding it's finding what works for you. Yeah. So I think like we recorded some stuff that we'll put on social media as well, but just by changing the width of your stance, by changing what your knees are doing, by changing where the bar sits, you can allow yourself to get into good positions. Like we work with a lot of like elite sprinters, and the reason why, one of the reasons why, because of the big glutes obviously that Rob said, but what they also tend to have is a very short torso and a very long femur. Right. Because long legs, short torso is optimal for running fast. It's not good for squatting. So so they need actually, but you can still develop a good squat pattern in an elite sprinter by just manipulating those variables that Rob said about in terms of stance, in terms of bar position, etc. So I think it is people have this idea of like, this is a squat, and these are and it's almost like these black and white rules about what the lift should look like. Whereas in kind of reality, it's not that. There's grey, and there's like being able to change a movement up to fit you. So those two things have to come together. That is, you can go onto YouTube, you can buy a book, you can look at the key things of a squat, but you've got to be able to then take that and actually make it work for your anatomy and also your range of motion at the time. And there's other things you can do to manipulate that to allow you to get in that position in your strength quality. And over time, you may have to change your squat again, because as you develop strength in certain areas, you develop range in certain areas, then you'll have to make those changes to bring them into play with how you squat. And it doesn't have to be just a squat; it can be any sort of lift. But I think that's a key thing that there's
100%.
And I guess again, why it's important to have somebody look and watch and kind of understand what's going
or
on.
Educate yourself. I think like the big thing is just understanding. I think like there's that whole thing of like that process of being like you're unconsciously incompetent at the start, right? And then you're consciously incompetent, and then you're consciously competent, and then you're unconsciously competent. And it's being aware, like it's understand this first bit. If you're unconsciously incompetent, that's dangerous. if you're consciously incompetent, that's when you can really start making changes, right? And that's when you can have awareness. So it just comes from that education and being able to actually look at yourself, with the amount of resources out now in terms of YouTube, being able to video yourself, have a look at yourself from different angles. You probably make a fair guess in terms of what you need to change on yourself as well. So
it's interesting about 20 it being an elite sport for 20 years. Did you say? I bet you've seen some real big changes. And
I mean I can't remember anyone doing a 10k run with a med ball. You're probably seeing more changes in conditioning than I've seen. But it sounds with
Oh damn. So how would you structure a program?
So for me, like, I think that bringing into play what we said, you've got certain exercises that are there to develop the important strength qualities. So upper body pulling strength and pushing strength, depending on you as an individual, are going to be key things. And also underpinning strength, as Rob said, is muscle mass, right? So in terms of there's a high relationship between we don't really like to get into this too much, because I think there's this thing about you can develop strength without size, but the reality is bigger, stronger.
Absolutely. And I think as well, like the thing that was that my PhD kind of revealed is that in certain sports, because of the repetitive movements required in whatever that sport is, you see almost like preferential development of certain areas, and I don't see any reason why jiu-jitsu wouldn't be similar to that. So there's a lot of hip extension power and strength required. There's a lot of pulling, isometric and dynamic kind of pulling power required. So you'd expect that the muscles of the posterior chain and actually them improving in size is going to have a relatively positive impact on what you want to try and do in the mats. And you think like the distribution of mass, so you can have two athletes the same weight, but where they distribute their mass can be completely different. So taking Rob's example from his PhD, you'd have like an elite sprinter that could weigh the same as a non-elite, but they'll hold more mass round their hips and less round their calves. Because they want this to be a bit lighter, because it's easier to pull through. In terms of it's not really it is generating force, but it's primarily there as a transducer of force. Whereas a lot of the power, especially when you're sprinting fast, the limiting factor suddenly comes up here. Now jiu-jitsu, I think you'll find the same thing. I think this will be the interesting evolution of jiu-jitsu over time, and you maybe already see it at the top end, where people like the top males, they do hold more muscle mass in their upper body than their lower body. And then the strength ratio in jiu-jitsu is very different than you would see certainly in our world of like elite sprinting, where the strength levels in the lower body would be massively higher than the strength levels of the upper body. Versus jiu-jitsu, where a lot of the research is it's almost 1-to-1. People are squatting as much as they're benching. And you're seeing that, and it sounds, oh god, you don't want to be squatting as much as you're benching, but like that's the reality of the sport.
Maybe
little
you do.
Spaghetti legs. That's what we've got in jiu-jitsu.
But maybe you do. Maybe you want, like, if you're going to hit a weight category, and this is where I'll maybe go, like if you're going to hit a weight category, maybe you do want to have your distribution different. You're still going to be hitting a certain weight category, but maybe you want to have more of that distribution in your upper body, because it's for jiu-jitsu, it's more important.
So how would you go, like for example, if somebody wanted to put more muscle mass on, what changes or how would you program that person, or what sort of things?
There's a number of ways you can do that, and I think like if you get into the nitty-gritty of sets and reps and things like that, I think one of the things that's becoming clear is you can build muscle mass across a huge spectrum of rep ranges. Like one of the key things in that is how close you bring that to muscular failure is going to be one of the key determinants there. And then there isn't necessarily hard and fast rules about total weekly volume. And it'll depend as well on things like frequency, etc. But if you're getting between 8 to 10 and up to 15, 16 working sets per muscle group per week, you're giving it a big old bash in terms of stimulus to actually change and develop the size there.
And I completely agree. It's you used to you read about sets and reps, right? And it was like, okay, for strength you're going to work between 2 and 4 reps. For hypertrophy you're going to work between 8 and 12 reps. And the reality, as Rob said, is all you're trying to do is stimulate signaling pathways, and so you get a chemical response to the training. So kind of it's less about what the exercise is or what it, you know, the sets and reps is. It's about getting that chemical response to the exercise, so as you stimulate adaptation.
Okay.
And you know, there's different factors that actually stimulate muscle mass growth. One is like just mechanical load, as Rob said. There is some stuff related to biochemistry in terms of you creating a sort of environment within your muscle that stimulates those signaling pathways as well. Food alone will stimulate. You know, there's multiple ways, and it's almost like how do you structure them across the week, also in a way that your body can actually respond to and adapt to and not break down because you've done too much again. So it's
Sorry, you go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to ask if there's any kind of ideal time that you would suggest somebody to lift, like in an ideal world where people, you know, didn't have to work, they didn't have to go to school or whatever.
So that's it's a difficult one because there's so many variables that'll go into that, and I think like first and foremost is prioritizing how important the lifting is relative to the other stuff. So the way I'll typically think about it is, well, what are the key things you're trying to develop in this particular training block? And if that happens to be a lot of technique work and time on the mats, then what you got to do is put that in first, and then see when your lifting sessions make sense around that. The flip side might be actually my jiu-jitsu I'm going to put on hold for 4 to 6 weeks or whatever that is, and I'm going to put in a really big strength block, and then you prioritize those sessions and fit the jiu-jitsu around that more so. So I think for me that's it's almost looking at how you prioritize what your number one thing is you're trying to shift. And
it's a good question. Like I imagine there is like some work that's been done on that. I mean, things that we do know, you're strongest about 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's when you tend to be strongest, and that's the most important factor for that there is just your body temperature.
Right.
So that's whenever your core temperature is highest, you get the highest levels of muscle temperature, and the warmth in your muscle is the thing that stimulates, you know, one of the most important factors, if everything else is equal, that will stimulate strength. Allow you to be strong because the muscle is able to contract better, essentially, whenever it's warm. So you do know that. So theoretically, then you could potentially say that actually, if I'm stronger, then I can generate more load if I was going. So therefore, it maybe would stimulate more adaptation. But I'd have to look further into that. But it's a good question.
Okay. And just going back, sorry to jump a little bit, but you talked about going to failure. Like, how far towards failure are we going, and why would you choose to go less towards failure and more?
It's an interesting question in the realm away from kind of gym bro and bodybuilding training, because obviously with that's their be all end all, and in a similar realm, you know, maybe strength sports or similar like CrossFit might fit into that as well. But whenever you've got your other technical training to be aware of, I think it's one thing that you got to keep in the forefront of your mind, that you can't be sacrificing all the other aspects by pushing super hard in the gym. So the thing around the training to develop muscle size, like it's proximity to failure, and making sure that you in the context of sport, it's making sure that you are within some sort of distance, you know, sort of 1 or 2 reps left in the tank per set, that sort of region. But what that's not doing is pushing you over the edge and actually carrying over loads of fatigue into your other aspects of your training. I like that idea of like reps in reserve and you know, stopping before failure. I think like I also like this concept of like it's almost like a spectrum, right? And if the volume's too low, it's ineffective, right? And if you like, if there's a weight that you could lift 20 times but you did it twice, you know, it's ineffective. And then as you go up that sort of spectrum, you've got what's called like the minimum effective dose, and then you've got a range between that minimum effective dose and that maximum effective dose. And that sort of maximum effective dose is kind of where you talked about in terms of that failure. But anywhere in between that sort of spectrum between the minimum and maximum, if you're working in there, you should be stimulating adaptation. So you don't need to go all the way to that end. You just need to make sure that you're not so far away from it that it's just stuff.
and it's just not a waste of time.
And how about in terms of like technique? Because you could say like, okay, I've got 1 rep in reserve, but it's ugly as SHIT.
Yeah.
Like, how we? Does it matter?
There's a few things that will kind of go into that, and I guess the main one for me is that when you're looking at failure, what you don't want to see is big breakdown of the technique. When we're talking in the realms of hypertrophy, you want to be bringing it close to muscular failure, and essentially the reason the technique is what it is because that's placing the most amount of signal to that given muscle or muscle group or whatever that is, and as soon as that technique breaks down, all of a sudden what you're doing is the external thing in terms of barbell movement or machine movement or whatever that is might be the same, but the actual stimulus you're placing on that particular structure isn't. So I think it's one of those things to be really aware of. Like the technique is very important to make sure that you're actually stimulating the right areas and maximizing your output in terms of that. And if you're happy with the technique and that's very consistent rep to rep and you're getting really good stimulus from that, then hopefully your technique isn't the thing that's dropping off. It's actually the capacity of the muscle to keep contracting and moving.
Yeah, that completely agree. Hey, I've got a question for you in terms of, because you mentioned that in terms of like conditioning.
Yeah.
Like whenever you did that sort of work, where you were doing like your long runs.
Yeah.
Like, did you feel that improved your fitness?
No, actually, because specifically what I remember actually is going from that training to training a little bit less and not doing that crazy training, and I actually recognized my body composition change. And I recognized that actually I was putting more muscle on and I wasn't getting like mega fatigued, and it was noticeable. And my friend actually did the similar pattern, and she said to me like, are you looking, are you feeling more muscular, like are you looking more muscle? I'm like, yeah. She's like, yeah, me too. I'm like, oh cool. Then we gave each other a little high five, and
so at that stage you're probably almost over that or maximum effective dose, and your body wasn't responding to it. But I do think like because one of the things we've talked about is that idea of like I think people there's probably like they're more likely to buy into strength training for jiu-jitsu, right, to help support, and then they probably, when we've talked about mobility, like makes sense as well in terms of doing mobility training to support. But like I think like one of the areas whenever I've talked to people that there's been probably the biggest resistance to is like conditioning, like running, like bike work.
No one likes cardio.
Nobody wants to do cardio to support jiu-jitsu, because it's kind of like they feel like you can get fit from doing jiu-jitsu. Is that kind of something that you've felt or experienced, or?
I mean, I've never really minded doing it, but yeah, if there's something that's gonna go and I don't want to, it's probably I definitely prefer strength training over cardio, but I will do it. If you said, Vanessa, do cardio, I'll be like, yeah, okay. Yes, boss.
Okay, fair. No, just again, it's an area that I'm certainly interested in because of the spectrum of strength and conditioning.
So would you say it's mega important?
I think it varies by like the stage someone is at their career. I think like again, like using analogies from like track and field. Sorry, my hands cramping. Using analogies from track and field. If you take like 800-meter running, whenever like a kid's starting off as an 800-meter runner, just running 800 meters over and over again, they'll get better, right? Because they're doing the event and they're going to get better and better and better. But there comes a point when just running 800 meters isn't enough anymore, because it's not overloading. Like the things that make up the ability to run 800 meters are you've got to be fast, you've got to have a good aerobic system, you've got a good anaerobic system, and you can't overload all of them by just running 800 because it's too far to sprint. It's not far enough to develop your aerobic system. So those things aren't getting that type of work. So you almost need then at a certain point to do some speed work. So do some 200 meters, 300 meter reps, and do some long runs to develop those other qualities up. So as when you come back in to running 800 meters, everything you need to push your performance on is there, and I think that's where I still think like we talk about the evolution of strength and conditioning within jiu-jitsu. I kind of think this is one of the areas that's going to be the biggest gains and where the area is to like really improve going forward. I think like you definitely, when you're starting out just doing jiu-jitsu, you'll get better at sustaining the ability to do jiu-jitsu, right? But I think when you get to your level, it becomes a bit harder because
you know when to rest.
Yeah, but yeah,
and you can rest.
Yeah, and you can roll with people, and you can be a lot more technical and a lot more efficient in terms of how you're doing it. Yeah. So it's not the same as like, you know, someone like me and Rob rolling, because we just have to go balled out the whole time. It's rubbish. But like, you know, it's a completely different thing.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, but it's a completely different thing. So I do think that at a certain point, and that'll be the next evolution of it in jiu-jitsu, is going to be non-specific conditioning. And there is some nice research coming out around that area that just at a certain level, just doing jiu-jitsu won't enhance your aerobic capacity, but actually people who've got a higher aerobic capacity are able to sustain performance through competitions and through training sessions better.
Okay.
And it comes back to again, some people might need to do that more.
Yeah.
Some people maybe don't need to do it as much. But I think there's going to be different ways, and I think the development of like training in a manner that overloads your different energy systems in different ways, kind of like the next step. We were talking about again earlier, that how do you, maybe it is like setting up different scenarios where someone has to work at a much higher level, so as that you can really like bring them up, ramp them up almost into that red zone for a period of time, and bring them back down. I'm not sure. I think that's to me that's a big area where there's a lot of room for development when it comes to jiu-jitsu is conditioning. But I certainly think adding in 1 to 2 like interval sessions a week, where you maybe not like very aggressive intervals, but you maybe going like 4 minutes on, 3 minutes easy, something like that, there will actually help improve that aerobic capacity, which should help your ability to sustain through training better.
So sorry, I just want to focus on the word overload a little bit, because you know there might be a time, for example, if you're injured and you're not able to do that, at what point, like what would you sort of deload somebody and try to work? I don't know.
Potentially, and I think it, like injury, depending on what the injury is, it might actually be an opportunity for you to almost take a backward step and think, well, what, you know, say the injury stops you rolling, and it's an injury to, I don't know, your knee or your ankle. Well, actually, that might be a really good time to really push your upper body strength on. And in terms of specifically around that word overload, like that's a great time to really overload that aspect of it. But what you're doing is deloading the specific thing that you can't do, and ramping up what you can do with the other stuff. And that might be a really good time to get some more non-specific conditioning in, you know, on a ski erg or something like that, or on a rower, and just using your something like that. It might be then a really good opportunity to push on muscle mass, push on your strength in the upper, you know. So it's an interesting one. It's I think like one of the things that we do a lot of in track and field is that when there's an injury, it's actually a time to tick a bunch of other boxes that are really important for the end performance. And that's probably something that whether you're a weekend warrior or a elite level competitor, it's worth thinking about. If you get injured, it doesn't just mean sit at home and wait for it to all blow over. You know,
I was literally going to say as well, like for mindset as well, like that's amazing.
It's a corny thing to say, but there's that like saying of like injury is an opportunity. Like I can think of an example recently where we had an athlete with like who broke a toe, and he couldn't run with it, but he could lift with it. So he had like a 3-4 week block of strength training where he really was able to push on his strength in a manner that he wouldn't have been able to do if he'd been running as well, because it just, again, that split between not being able to go hard on everything, he was able to take that opportunity, and now he's back running. He's actually feeling better than he was previously, because he's had that opportunity to develop those characteristics.
That's
so
super cool.
So I think that's a nice way to think about it in terms of that opportunity.
Have you guys got anything else to add? Like, is there anything else?
There was one thing that I think it's important to touch on. Obviously, we spoke a few minutes ago about the importance of muscle mass, and I think that it's probably worthwhile making clear that it's not necessarily something that we practice in isolation, and the program isn't just about developing that. I think there's a huge emphasis on aspects of the other sides of the training in terms of developing maximum strength, developing mobility, developing, and I think then what you've kind of got to do is, whenever you're actually pulling that program together, is understand what are the key things and structure them in an order that makes sense of priority. You know,
that's cool. All right, should we wrap it up?
We can wrap it up there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much,
All right,
guys.
No problem at all. Thank you. And we'll probably say thank you to FXD Fitness as well.
Absolutely.
And for the backing soundtrack that everyone, I'm sure, can hear.
Yeah, thank you, FXD, for having us and allowing us to host our podcast in your gym.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Cool.
Catch you there, guys.
Bye.
Cheers, guys. Bye.